Chapter 6, 2009 to 2010. In the spring of 2009, I sold my house in Stone Ridge, and while I was in the process of doing so, I looked for a place to rent. I had seen a few rough ones, and they left me terrified that those were the only options I could choose from within my budget. One day after seeing an ad in a local newspaper, I called the owner and drove to the house. On the way there, I listened to Jesus Take the Wheel by Carrie Underwood. I'm not a country fan, but I felt the song. Jesus take the wheel, take it from my hands, 'cause I can't do this on my own, I'm letting go. The lyrics meant something different to me than what they were intended to, I'm sure. I wasn't thinking of Jesus in a Christian context, but in the car on my way there, I had a moment with him. I put my house hunting in his hands. It wasn't a prayer, it was something I would only be able to identify more clearly later on. I will try to convey this now. We spend most of our time in our wrong minds, our ego selves. Even the times we feel good might be inside the ego mind. Yes, it's sneaky that way. Our lives are dictated by mostly unconscious choices. Based on what was out there, getting a rental that was decent in my price range was close to impossible. That moment in the car with Jesus wasn't planned. I didn't pray for it or consciously look for it. The song transported me to a place within myself where I could accept his love, if only for a tiny moment. Those moments are usually enough to switch the tracks the train is on. The chorus calls a moment like this the holy instant. It is a moment that takes us out of our ego minds and to a place of peace. Various aspects of our lives may or may not change afterwards. Sometimes the road we were on before changes ever so slightly toward a different outcome. It says, "A major contribution of miracles is their strength in releasing you from your false sense of isolation, deprivation, and lack." That is in the text, chapter 1, section 1. Once we are released from our belief in isolation, deprivation, and lack, we are free to make a different choice. Again, sometimes the outside world changes afterward. At others, it doesn't. This was one of those moments when I believe a different outcome was visible immediately. I met the owner, we hit it off, and made a deal right there. I'd pay $1,000 per month, everything included. The place was absolutely perfect. Within a stone's throw of the rail trail for biking and dog walking, close to my work, quiet, private, my own tiny cottage, and the preserve only minutes away. We never had a lease, no security deposit. We shook hands, and that was that. The moment I met the owner, I wasn't focused on getting the apartment I wanted. I couldn't have imagined a place as good as this one. It wouldn't have been possible. That's one reason why, for me, vision boards don't quite work. They do to a degree, but as we don't know what's best for us, how do we know that a certain house or lifestyle or vacation best serves our needs? I would have never been able to envision this place. It was too odd and quirky and brilliant. Over the years, I came to the realization that I cannot know what's in my best interest. I can, however, try to get my ego out of the way. That increases the chances for an outcome that works perfectly for that moment in time. There's another aspect to this, and one I would fully discover only years later. If our intention is to have the best outcome for everyone involved, not only us, we are on a less rocky path already. The chances of us having peace or a peaceful experience are much higher if we include other people. As our wish to separate is the only problem, joining is the only solution. The joining, in my experience, is always the most important part. Not what we're getting, but what we can give. Long story short, I moved into the house and loved every minute of it. It was the best place I've lived until then. Behind my newly found little cottage was a path up a hill that I hiked on frequently. The landscape there felt, for lack of a better word, ancient. Moss-covered rocks jutted out from the ground like spears. Crippled pine trees stood like old guardians of the forest. The top of the hill gave way to a magnificent vista of the valley below. I felt at home. One of the sessions with Julie came, I believe, out of one of the hikes there. Ancient landscapes. I'm somehow drawn to ancient landscapes, I heard myself say to Julie. On my way to her practice, I had thought about this, but couldn't figure out why it had come to me. In our sessions, we had explored different inner landscapes, usually connected to a conflict I was experiencing or an issue I was working on. That morning, before I arrived at her house, I realized that I had no idea what to talk to her about, or so I thought. We spoke about a couple of things like my work and my son's visit and my girlfriend. About an hour into the session, I hear myself mentioning the ancient landscapes to her and that I somehow felt drawn to them. There's nothing specific in my mind as I speak. Julie asks me if I want to close my eyes for a minute and see what comes up. Usually for that, I'd lie on her table and we go through this process a bit differently. Today, we don't have that much time left, and I really want to see where this ancient landscape is and what it means, if anything. I close my eyes for a while. I wait for an image to show up. It doesn't. Nothing happens until at some point the words, "before time was," appear. I tell Julie about it and that I feel that the ancient landscape I'm referring to might have been there before time was. This is obviously an oxymoron because how can something exist, a stone, a tree, or a forest, before time existed? Without time, there's no growth and nothing can start or end or be at all. Those and other thoughts come through my mind in a split second, but I feel that there's something else there, something I had missed or hadn't understood properly. Then I see, almost in a close-up, a couple of old stones overgrown with moss. As I pull back, I realize that I stand in the center of what must have been an old foundation. The stones are almost completely grown into the ground and grass covers the soil. Judging by the outline and size, it must have been an old church or chapel. For some reason, I have the distinct feeling that the ground I stand on is very holy. Holy in the sense of clean, untouched, undisturbed, and very old. Another thing is very interesting, for there's absolutely no sound. It's not just the absence of noise, it is complete stillness. Nothing moves. The spot and its immediate surroundings feel suspended. I realize when I speak to Julie about what I see that I'm barely breathing. My breath is completely quiet, as if I almost don't need to breathe at all. For a second I panic and think about what if I stopped breathing altogether, but that passed. I could feel the ancientness of this place, as if it had been there before time was. And then something very unexpected happens. As I look at the partial wall in front of me, where I surmise once stood the altar of a church, suddenly, and I can't describe this any differently, the walls begin to rebuild themselves. But not with their original materials made out of stone, granite, plaster, and wood. No, the walls rebuild themselves out of light. As if the stones had merely the shape of a stone, but were not made of stone at all, but of pure light. After a while, the church walls reach the ceiling, closing the gap until what I see is the most beautiful building imaginable, with all the details like moldings, figurines, and ornaments, completely intact, but made not of their usual material, but out of light. The whole building has a soft glow to it. It is slightly transparent but looks very solid, and yet not solid in the usual sense, clearly defined, very strong, but transparent. What I see is a perfect representation of what had been there originally, and what is broken, deteriorated by eons of time, is still there, untouched and unchanged. As if everything that exists in time still has its original shape from before time was. The image of the finely outlined church made of light against the gray sky is magnificent. Then, for reasons that escape me, I think about chocolate kisses. My girlfriend sometimes put little Hershey chocolate kisses on my desk in my office. A while back in a shop, I found some of those kisses made not of chocolate, but of clear hand-blown glass. I gave her one and kept one for myself. Last week, mine somehow fell to the floor and the tip broke off. I was upset for a moment and asked myself naturally what that was all about, but calmed myself down after thinking that this was silly. Now in my vision, I see this broken piece of glass in my mind on the mantelpiece of my living room, and overlaying it is its perfect shape made out of light. Nothing's broken. It is still there in its intended form, and it is absolutely beautiful. I can't grasp the meaning of it all, but I know that this is significant. Then I think that our bodies and everything we see and feel and touch have a perfect representation that is made of light. Our families, our past, our cars, a blade of grass, and a teacup have, unseen by us, a perfectly intact representation of itself overlaying it. Relationships that seemed to end or were destroyed or broken are still intact in their original form. The body of a sick person has its perfect light form still present, and things we destroyed, people we hurt, parts of us that were damaged are still there, untouched and far, far beyond destruction. Years later, the image of the buildings made of light would make its way into The Three Feathers, a book I wrote in 2012. The book was, in more ways than one, a continuation of those imaginary journeys with Julie in fable form. The culmination of this time period, which was also a culmination of my life until that moment, was a sequence called The Gap. I wrote it down right after the session with Julie in which it happened. The gap. For as long as I can remember, I longed. I longed for love. Not so much for fame or fortune or riches or my own sailboat. No, I longed for love. It was on a flight back from a recent family visit to Germany that I found myself asking the question of how to bridge that gap inside of me between the part that always longs and the object of my longing. It seemed impossible. My first memory of longing was in first grade when I fell in love with a girl in my class who lived across the street from our house. I remember we went on a school bus trip and I sat next to her the whole time, dreading the moment when we would step off the bus and part ways. That was my first memory. I have longed ever since, and probably longer. Longing became my second nature. I was never alone for long, and longing and its fulfillment had become who I was. A couple of months ago, in one of the sessions with Julie, I saw an image of me standing on one side of a great canyon. On the other side, far in the distance, was the love that I longed for. It wasn't a person, rather a state of being. I have had inklings of being on the other side lately. Usually for very, very short periods of time, I experience the freedom of not having this almost constant tugging, searching, and not finding. Finding and then finding out that whatever I thought I had found was not what I was looking for in the first place. The gap between me and love, these two diametrically opposed states of being, seemed impossible to bridge, and so was the distance between where I stood at one end of the massive canyon and love on the other side. There was no way of getting to the other side. The gap stretched out for miles. Its depth was only imaginable. The only thing that connected one side of the massive canyon to the other was a rope. It looked frail and thin and slippery. There's just no way, I thought to myself. Next, I found myself hanging from the rope in the middle of the canyon. I realized in terror that there was absolutely no chance for me to make it to the other side. Neither would I ever be able to go back to where I came from. My fear of letting go of the rope was equally overwhelming, so I just hung there. My hands cramped around the now slightly slippery rope. What would happen if you'd let go? Julie asked. I don't know, I'd fall, I said, my mouth filled with sawdust. At one point, I just couldn't hold on anymore and my hands opened. The split second of anticipation of my fall gave way to the strange sensation of hovering, suspended in the air for a while, and then slowly sinking down toward the ground. It felt as if I was carried and held at the same time. I lay on the ground, very comfortably in the grass, looking up toward the sky. I saw the right side of the cliffs where I stood before, and the left side where I thought I needed to get to. The rope was now not more than a thin thread floating in the air high above me. As I lay there very peacefully, it came to me. It was suddenly clear as a winter sky that I would never be able to bridge the gap, ever. not in this lifetime, nor all the lifetimes I still had in front of me. The gap would always be there, and there was just no way that I could ever traverse it. But neither did I have to. The thought came quietly, as if it had to sneak into my mind behind all the devastation and fear and an overwhelming sense of doom. It stood there undisturbed by all the raucous shrieking. Its presence was strong but gentle, quiet but loud as thunder. I don't have to bridge the gap. That was it. The statement had little meaning to me as of yet. The thought that I could not bridge the gap but did not need to bridge it either had very little impact on my conscious mind until the moment it opened itself up like a flower in the morning sun, unfolding and unveiling its full beauty and fragrance and depth to me, overwhelming me with joy and hope and a sense of deep, deep comfort. There's a line in the movie The Matrix when Neo, waiting for the Oracle, watches a little boy bend a spoon with his mind. Neo asks the boy how he does it. The boy tells Neo, "Ask not how to bend the spoon, just know that there is no spoon." While I laid on the table in Julie's practice on a Friday morning around 11 a.m., it occurred to me that the need I had felt my whole life, this longing to be complete, was a trick. A very inventive one, but still a trick, a sleight of hand, a smokescreen to prevent me from accepting the one simple truth about myself. I was and am and always will be complete. There has never been a gap, a search for love, no distance between me and what I had longed for all my life. The presence of the thought in my mind radiated waves and waves into every dark corner, illuminating my being with millions of lights. Its loveliness was complete, its care and comfort simply not of this world. There's nothing to do, I thought to myself, no process, no journey, no overcoming, no challenge, no tests and no accomplishments, just the simple acceptance of what is already here. Something clicked within me during that session. One of the puzzle pieces of my life, lost somewhere in the depth of my subconscious, fell into place. It was quiet. Nothing changed immediately. I was still the same person, but felt that where I had been in a rushing stream before, my little boat now floated upon a quiet lake. This wasn't the end of the journey, but it was the end of a major segment of it, one rife with struggle. The search for love that had occupied me since I was very young had come to an end.